Hello, and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I have a real grungy one for you. I have the semifinals bout from the EHMS Longsword Open, which is a small, I think, in-house tournament in Finland, and it features two people who I have not heard of before and have not been on the channel before, but who had a really interesting fencing style and some really interesting exchanges, particularly in the form of what I would call a short edge deflecting cut. Now, I don't know which person is which, I just have the name of the YouTube video to go off of, but I'm sure someone down in the comments will tell me who is who after I publish the video. But until then, we're just going to go with fighter on the left and fighter on the right, just like we always do. So for our first exchange, there's nothing super interesting in this particular one, though the person I want you to be paying attention to is fighter on the right here, the one furthest away from the camera. And the reason I want to pay people to pay attention to that is because they have a very particular way of trying to parry. Namely, they always throw Zorns, aka they always actively throw what is basically a cut straight into the blade of their opponent, while simultaneously threatening that they might hit their opponent if they got too close. The reason I want to point this out is that this is actually pretty normal and a pretty normal way of executing a parry. Namely, that in active parry like this one, where you're really swinging at the sword, the risk factors involved are overswinging or just swinging at something that's not there. And in this case, neither of those things happened. But what you're seeing is a kind of issue where both people are trying to attack via the same line. You see fighter on the left here, closest to the camera, throws their initial attack in, it gets parried. And as they both pull away from their one active attack and two active parry, they both have a second where they have to rechamber and come back in, and they both rechamber and come back in along the same line. And it's a common kind of problem that you see because A, you pretty much know which angle they're going to be coming in when they rechamber onto their dominant side. They're going to attack on that same side, and therefore you have to parry again. And you get into this kind of weird looking loop where people are just kind of throwing the same thing over and over again until something happens. But what we're going to see in the next exchange is our first adaptation, and where we get to the real crux of the reason why I made this video. So, fighter on the right, furthest from the camera, who has just had some problems, throwing a Zorn, chambering, and then throwing it again, and maybe not getting exactly what they wanted, has decided to change guards. They've gone from being in a high vom tog with their sword up by their shoulder to now lower and down by their hip. They do to go for a little bit into a Meyer stance for a second, but I think it's just a little bit of a telegraph to try to get their opponent to charge them. But they end up in this low guard, and at which point the fighter on the left, who has moved more to the actual left now, throws a more normal kind of attack straight in along the dominant side line, as they normally would, but instead of parrying in the exact same ways we saw the first time, fighter on the right now does what I would call a short edge deflection. And this is not a technique that you see a lot because it's very risky. But if you do it right, there's a lot of real serious benefits that you can get. And the benefits are what you can see here. When you throw a short edge deflection and it ends up on this one side, you are now already pre-chambered for your follow-up attack. And this takes away the little intermediary rechambering session that we saw from the first set of Zornhau and offensive actions. The idea here is that if you successfully do your short edge parry, you are now primed and ready to throw your follow-up cut, and it's going to happen at a much faster tempo and along a much tighter line than it would have been if you had thrown a Zorn from a high guard, like a high vom tog, into that same opposing line. You don't have to rechamber in the exact same way, and you end up doing what would essentially be the Duplirin play, but from a completely different starting position and a completely different, guard position. Now, for this next exchange, the third exchange, we see another interaction that's rather similar. Fencer on the left goes in with a big committed attack that gets short edge parried off to the side. Now, the thing I want to point out about this one is another one of the benefits of the short edge parry is that it doesn't actually feed a lot of momentum into the blade of your opponent, which can be bad in the sense that the more momentum you put in, the harder your parry is, but it can also be good in this kind of interaction where if someone is overcommitted, a lot of times they use the pressure they feel on their blade to tell them when they're out of position. Say, for example, they throw that really hard thrust straight down the middle and you push them off to the side. The harder you push, the more they know, okay, I'm going to miss. It's time to Zverik out of it. If you do a short edge deflection, you don't put nearly as much pressure into the blade, which means you might short circuit your opponent's brain and pre-wired, attacks and defenses, and they might think, oh, I actually might still make it into the arm, I might still make it into the thigh or the hip or somewhere. So they're going to commit that ever so slightly bit much more and maybe end up in a much more compromised position, as you see here. Fencer on the left charges in, and after they get parried, they have to take this big, long passing step that puts them completely out of position and puts them in a situation where they can't remise effectively, they can't throw another attack, and they just get bonked right on the top of the head. Also, another thing to point out, which isn't all that important, Fencer on the right does their short edge deflection, again, as we saw, but instead of coming back down the same line a la a, Duplirin kind of tactic, they go back around the side of their head and attack along a different line. The reason this is important is because normally when you Zorn, pulling off and attacking a different line has that exact same rechambering problem, plus another rechamber of a different type. So technically speaking, what this is doing is it's using the fact that you get a free rechamber in the effect of a tempo to now change the angle of attack to make sure that you're not all that predictable. So for this next exchange, we actually have a little bit of a role reversal. Instead of the fencer on the right throwing the short edge deflection, it is now going to be the fencer on the left throwing the short edge deflection. And while this kind of turns into a little bit of a messy grapple situation, I do want to point out once again that we see another short edge deflection from fencer on the left in response to a big heavy thrust from fencer on the right, and that this results in a slightly different outcome than what we saw last time. Rather than them being able to back up effectively and get the distance and throw that counterattack, they get bound up and they get stuck in a grapple, which ends the way you saw it ends. So the other thing to pay attention to here is that the short edge deflection is something that can result very heavily in a grapple, but in my opinion, it's one that can end in a very favorable grapple. If you want to imagine a situation where you're trying to parry something that's coming down towards you, by pushing up, you are effectively counteracting the momentum. But at the exact same time, what we recognize is as human beings with our arms attached to our shoulders, we have to deal with the fact that when someone is going to grapple you, they're going to reach out with their arms at full extension and try to manipulate your shoulder line, your arms, and your head. That means that when you're coming up with the short edge deflection, you are effectively shoving their arms upwards. And that can actually be a very effective place to put them. Because if their hands go down, they're going to be able to get to your hips and underneath your arms, and they're going to get underhooks, and they're going to be able to control your torso pretty effectively. But if you push it up, they're going to have to go for overhooks. They're going to have to try to stop a pommel strike or a cut to the head, and that might still be an okay place to do it. But if you can effectively use your technique here with the short edge deflection and get that underside position underneath of their hands, you can push up, shove their hands out of the way, and then get those underhooks for yourself. Or you can shoot through the middle in their now dominant position and go for some kind of cheeky pommel strike, or just disconnect your left hand and, wind it over onto their side and try to pull your hand back. In this particular case, that's not what we saw at all, but I want to point out that knowing what to do in these particular grapple positions is a really good idea if you're going to switch your defensive option. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is the difference between this and a cron parry. You've seen on this channel a whole lot of times, especially from me, throwing the cron parry in a very similar kind of style, and I wanted to kind of distinguish the difference between a short edge deflection and a cron parry. Now, the obvious difference is that the cron parry has the crossguard horizontal, straight across the side, and the idea is that it makes a kind of net to catch the blade as you're pushing up so that it protects your head. Great. However, the short edge deflection uses a slightly different method. By throwing a more like 45-degree angle chopping cut upwards, what you're trying to do is more effectively shove the sword that's coming in at you off to one side or the other, and this gives you different outcomes and different options. The cron parry's biggest problem is that if you don't go high enough, you just get hit on the top of the head. The short edge deflection's problem is that if you go in at too steep of an angle or too shallow of an angle, you might end up pushing that blade onto one of your sides and getting hit anyway. But if you pull it off, by pushing them off to the side, you can often get a much better overcompromised, overcommitted position out of your opponent than if you cron parry. Cron parry, again, you send them up, which means if they overcommit, they end up kind of crashing into you coming in a straight line. If you short edge cut them off to the side, they're going to continue off in that direction and maybe get a little lost along the way, meaning that you're going to have a lot more openings to deal with. So, If you want to integrate the short edge deflection into your own game, remember the pros, remember the cons, and especially if you're the kind of person like me who loves to cron parry all the time, try mixing this in every once in a while, especially as a defense against big committed Oberhaus to your head or big committed thrusts to your chest. You might find that you end up in a much better position even if you get to the point where they close in enough to grapple. So, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see more footage and more breakdowns like this, I'm going to have another video on Thursday, though I have absolutely no idea what it's going to be on. Until then, I'll probably make a short on Wednesday or something like that. See you next time.